Thank you and welcome to the show this morning. The topic this morning is the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and public education in the South. And we have with us to talk about the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and public education in the South, Professor KSanford, a professor in the Department of Sociology at Tennessee State University. And of course, Dr. Sanford, let me welcome you to the show this morning.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you so much for inviting me.
And to tell you how delighted we are to have you with us, Dr. Sanford. I'm reminded that not long ago you first made your appearance on this show, and you talked about higher education in the 21st century, and of course we've received so many compliments in reference to that particular show. But what we'd like to do today, Dr. Sanford, is to talk about the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and to talk about how that act had some impact upon public education in the South. But before we do that, let's have you to give our audience some information about your background, your education, and some of the things that eventually led you to Tennessee State University, because I'm sure that some of them probably did not have an opportunity to see the last show that you did with us. So give us that information, and then we'll be able to talk about the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and public education in the South.
Well, certainly, and I would first like to thank you so much for inviting me this morning, as well as having such a profound show that really offers a different perspective. Again, I am KSanford, and I presently am associate professor in the Department of Sociology at Tennessee State University. My background is very varied, but I've been in education my entire life. I received my PhD from Howard University in Washington, D.C., as well as my master's degree from North Carolina Central University in Durham, North Carolina. I also received a postdoc degree at the Pennsylvania State University in State College, Pennsylvania. I'm also very proud of a number of other types of work opportunities I've had in addition to being in education. One with the national headquarters of the American Red Cross in Washington, D.C., working with HIV/AIDS education, the American Association of Retired Persons, doing victims assistance programs in crime, as well as the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives. We also had a victim assistance program.
And so you've been involved in a whole variety of activities during your career, Dr. Sanford. What we'd like to do is to look at the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Dr. Sanford, as we indicated earlier, and to have you to give us some preliminary statements in reference to where that Act of 1964 stands in reference to the history of the African American in this country.
Yes. Well, it's a very important act. As you may very well know and have already stated, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was implemented at that particular time period because of the egregious nature of our society, the prejudice, discrimination that had historically been here in America. It was put forth to try to give some really fair accommodations, if you will, to public facilities and education, in the job force, and all of the different components of the society in which we live in. And I'd be remiss not to take us back a little bit and to frame this act of 1964, because it's, as you've stated, it's about 40 years ago. But for 244 years, there was enslavement here in America. And that was one of the worst types of peculiar institutions, as Dr. Kenneth Stamp would mention, that the history of the world has ever noticed. Of course, there has always been slavery in antiquity, but this one was somewhat peculiar. All the literature indicates that. And then 81 years of Jim Crow laws that came after that. You're talking about 1861 to 1865 with the civil rights, with the Civil War, I'm sorry. And then during that Civil War, coming out of that with the Reconstruction from around 1866 to 1870, came the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, the 14th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment. Some of my viewers might not realize or remember, the 13th Amendment actually freed Africans. 14th Amendment gave citizenship rights, and the 15th Amendment gave the right to vote. So an excellent question would be, why are we talking about the Civil Rights Act of 1964?
Yeah, good, very good. And of course, Dr. Sanford, we're getting ready, and we'll talk about that when we come back during the second segment, because we're getting ready for the first commercial break.
Okay.
But I think that what you've done here, you've laid a very fertile foundation to talk about this Act of 1964, because the question, as you indicated, is almost natural. That is, if the 13th Amendment was freed Africans, if the 14th Amendment gave them, quote, civil rights, then why another right? And that will allow you, I think, when we come back to talk about some of the activities in that particular period that kept Africans from enjoying all of the rights that they were accorded in the Civil Rights Act of 1866. I think that's, and of course, we're making preparations for our first commercial break, and we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. Thank you, and welcome back to the second segment of the show for today. The topic is the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and public education in the South. And we're talking to the professor of sociology at Tennessee State University, Dr. KSanford. And of course, Dr. Sanford, let us continue our discussion from the last segment by giving you an opportunity to talk about the right of 1866, the Civil Rights Act of 1866, as well as that of 1964, and make some kind of comparisons as you so desire.
Okay, and thanks so much again. In 1866, you had the Civil Rights Act at that particular time period with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment to the Constitution that you would have thought would have given certain levels of civil rights, civil liberties to people of African descent as indeed being citizens of the United States. However, as you may imagine, a lot of resistance came about as a result of that. And so during this Reconstruction period, there was really almost an enactment of re-enslavement. And people really rose to try to prevent those types of civil liberties and that one act actually represented. So to carry you forth from that time period of 1870 after Reconstruction, we continued, and everything was very much the same with Jim Crow laws, with very strong segregation types of incidents. And of course, 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson, our Supreme Court placed a frame that said everything had to be separate and of course unequal. Although of course it was Plessy versus Ferguson, separate and everything equal, we know indeed that it was unequal. Absolutely. And that was the law of the land. So when we look back on it, we can see how egregious of an act that was based on our Supreme Court and the citizens throughout the United States to then still keep people who have been here for hundreds of years in subservient types of conditions.
So you know, Dr. Sanford, say something about Jim Crow, because about the differences in the accommodations and et cetera under that system. Good.
Yeah, Jim Crow was a very egregious type of an act. What they had was things that were so-called separate, but they were indeed unequal. Many people might have images of we're talking about the school systems in the South. My mother, if I may just bring her up as a case study, during this particular time period, taught in a 2-room schoolhouse. She taught grades the 1st through the 7th from Oxford, North Carolina, and Mrs. Benjamin Chavis' mother, Mrs. Benjamin Chavis, taught the 8th grade through the 12th grade. Now, other public schools had just a regular class and regular school system, as you may know of today. But these 1-room little schools were not up to par. They were not equipped with the same type of educational opportunities as they were for everyone else. But it was the same way for every other accommodation that you could have possibly thought about that should have been open for everyone in the society to live in. And this is the type of a Jim Crow law that you had. It made everything certainly totally unequal, and it was very egregious on the part of our government, state, national, and even local governments that caused it and inflicted that upon a people. But we are here today to talk about education and that whole educational process, which is, of course, very important from a sociological point of view, to try to help people to move from one place in their socioeconomic status to another location in life. So when you think about hundreds of years of preventing that, then if you think about even today, we would still have many people who are first generation entering into institutions of higher learning. Why? Because it was based on what had happened a long time ago. And that's very important. That's very important because as we move through that time period of Jim Crow laws and leading from the Plessy versus Ferguson, of course, we've talked about the infamous 1954 Brown versus Board of Education. And coming out of that time period, incidentally, I was born years after that, and where I went to school, it was still segregated. To give you some idea how, because the letter of the law was written, that didn't necessarily mean that it was going to be implemented. And so after that period, there was an uprise of people of consciousness of kind, and everyone, of course, knows the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Tried to get equal access for people, just fairness. In many instances, we would define Dr. King as an assimilationist. He really wanted everything just to have equal access, to actually have just accommodations that were indeed equal. And so worked very hard for that. And I think this particular act of 1964 certainly represents that whole movement to try to bring about what the Constitution of the United States and the Declaration of Independence stated by the founding fathers of America. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This whole issue of justice within the educational system.
And of course, we're still fighting that issue in a real sense, are we not, Dr. Sanford?
Absolutely. We are still today, unfortunately, in 2004, 40 years later, we still have disparities when it comes to education. We still have disparities when it comes to certain types of equal opportunities within the society in which we live in. Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois in 1903 did a classic piece entitled The Souls of Black Folks. And in that piece, he talked about the demarcations that went on during the time period that we have just laid out and how it would then, of course, impact the 20th century. When he said the problem of the 20th century would be that of the problem of the color line. And here we are in the 21st century and it's the same problem.
100 years later.
100 years later. And indeed, when we look at the latest research, when you think in terms of Brown versus Board and desegregation policies, schools have now started to become resegregated. And we see this throughout the United States and even here in the state of Tennessee and as well as in other states. If you start looking at it with a, I guess in a narrow way of understanding this particular issue and how it's impacting people. So we have to be very careful of that. And there are many other scholars like Dr. Hannibal Shabazz, Dr. Francis Cress Welsing, myself and other social scientists are very kind of interested in looking at how some of these issues are still very pervasive today with people who are the so-called power elite are superimposing their values in a negative way toward others who have not had certain types of equal opportunities. So we still have to understand that we do not have a certain level of equality today and that we still have to fight for it.
And we ought to continue to celebrate this act of 1964 because it gave us at least a start in terms of trying to deal with some of the issues that we have now. Would that be a good assessment as we make preparations for this this second commercial break?
Yeah, absolutely. We certainly need that. And when you think in terms of Thurgood Marshall and as he fought so hard, he looked at the letter of the law and tried to bring about constitutional rights for it. So this is why this is so important for us to celebrate, because it did give certain types of opportunities. And Dr. King fought for that and died for that, as well as many other people out there who fought for it. So yes, it is certainly worthy of celebration, but we still have a lot of work to do.
Dr. Sanford, what I'd like to do as we make preparations for this second commercial break during this last segment is to have you to, in a real sense, address our young people. That is to talk in terms of dealing with them, in terms of their responsibility and what they ought to do in order to make the Civil Rights Act of 1964 a reality.
Absolutely.
And we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. Thank you and welcome back to the show today. The topic is the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and public education in the South. And we're talking to Dr. Kelly Sanford. And of course, Dr. Sanford, as we promised during the second segment, that we would give you an opportunity to talk about some other aspects of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and public education in the South. And let's give you an opportunity to do that now.
Okay, and I thank you again. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was very instrumental in trying to allow equal access, equal opportunity. And that brings us to the whole issue of the importance of our students today, family members, to understanding this act and the whole history behind it. We find that at our institutions of higher learning that many are entering and they are not recognizing this act, they're not recognizing what went on during the Civil Rights Movement. Why? Because they were born in the 80s. And that to them is the past. I think we have an obligation to allow our students, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of social class, to know about the history of America and the importance of all of these acts and that occurred throughout the history of America. It's so important. And of course, I make an effort to do that in all of my classes. We will review, if you will, Eyes on the Prize, to give them some historical backdrop of what went on during the Civil Rights Movement so that they can get a feel that they have certain freedoms that other people had to really fight for, protest for, and give up, in many instances, their lives for. So it's very important educationally. This act also allowed us to have certain types of equal opportunities within the labor force, which I always try to share with them, and I think there's a misperception, misinformation in many instances about how this led to a dialogue, if you will, of affirmative action, and how affirmative action is something that was put into place that would allow equal access. But I hear many people when I watch talk shows, very well educated, probably well-meaning people that are really giving it a bad name. They would use words like quotas or set-asides, or they would use something like preferences. And this is not what affirmative action is. It wasn't set there for that reason. Because of that historical backdrop that we've already talked about, many people, just by human nature, would not ever think about being equal or think about being fair because we've grown up in a society that was totally unfair. If I may cite very quickly, Alex de Tocqueville, he has an excellent piece entitled Democracy in America. And in that philosophical piece, he indicates very strongly, as he visited America, wanting to look at our penal system, and as he traveled from New York through the Deep South, he could not imagine what he saw. People of African descent, that's right, people of African descent all shackled up. And he said that this has been going on for hundreds of years, that we would never reach a true democracy. And that is why these acts are there for us to know about so that we can continue to fight for equality. You see, if we have that historical backdrop of inequality, and it's been there for such a long period of time, it is actually embedded within the mindset of the culture of America. And that's why we always have to have people who are sensitive to it, educated about it, and that's why a policy such as affirmative action is indeed still needed today. And we have other organizations indeed that really make an effort to try to make some fairness, some justice there, such as the NAACP. They are nonpartisan. They are just trying to fight for equal rights. And I think if you would talk with them, they say, we would like to abolish that organization tomorrow if things were equal, the Urban League. And one of my associations, the Association of Social and Behavioral Sciences, where we've always had a number of scholars who've been a part of that, trying to bring about social change within the society in which we live in, taking a Du Bois model. And before ending, this whole idea of affirmative action, helping with this equal access, we have to be very clear that it's there just to give equal access. And not tokenism, where you take a qualified person and then just place them from place to place and remove other people and say, well, by law, we still have a person. That is tokenism. So we have to be very clear on that. It's very egregious and anomalous to do those types of things within education as well as in the workplace. That is why an act such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is so very important for us to know about and also be very clear on it as we maneuver throughout this 21st century.
You know, Dr. Sanford, we've got about 5 more minutes before we end the show for today. But I'm reminded that when you talk about access in the Civil Rights Act of 1964, that there's so many young people today who perhaps would like to attend an institution of higher education, but somehow feel that since they don't have the financial resources available and whatnot, that it's almost impossible for them to do so. But why don't you say something about the great possibilities that can be achieved, even without the financial resources, if you're willing to work hard and do whatever. Say something in reference to that.
And I think that's a very important question that needs to be addressed. Education is available, it is here, and there are always ways of being able to enter and to matriculate through the institution of higher learning. In many instances at the university, there are certain types of scholarships, might be certain types of work opportunities while you're there, and in many instances, like many of us, we would work and go to school. But we had as a goal and objective in our life to accomplish an education and to get our degree, because we knew that would help manifest our ideals and our goals in the future. So I would say to any student that is out there to really have your objectives in place, know that you want to achieve it, and go out and work real hard, and you will find people at the institution that will be there and willing to work with you to get the money to be able to go. And sometimes indeed you have to have a part-time job. I know the majority of my students, they work and go to school, and so it is possible to do that. And so I would encourage anyone to do it. But I would also like to say, I think it's very important for us to think about education from pre-kindergarten through elementary school, through junior high school, through high school, before we get there and start learning and doing your very best in school and learning everything that you can so you can be prepared when you get there. That is very important. There are many opportunities and financial assistance available.
You know, Dr. Sanford, during the last 3 minutes we have, let's have you to perhaps say something about the status of education in the South and how for so long the South ranked number 48 or 49 in almost every category. Speak to that and how you see things becoming much better in the southern parts of the United States.
Well, I would hope indeed that they will get better, but we are sitting in a state right now that is still 48th or 49th in the entire union as far as education is concerned. But when we say that, that is not to say that we don't have some private schools that are doing very well. But when you think in terms of public education, there are many southern states that are still way behind as far as equal opportunity, as far as educational success. And I think we really need to have some educators, some people who empower, who are sensitive to that. And this comes from really the top down and all the way down to the local area. But we have to have someone who is really sensitive to it, willing to put some money behind the claim of wanting to have improvements there. I think we have excellent teachers. We're having different social problems that are emerging into the society in which we're living in, because we're living in a telecommunications society and technology, and that's pulling people away from wanting to just sit and read for the sake of reading and feeling they are getting something out of it. So we're going to have to use some very innovative ways of reaching our students today. But if we had that as sincere goals and objectives and tasks to accomplish them, I think we could really have some good outcomes. But we really need to look at it very seriously.
Well, do you think, Dr. Sanford, that we could really say that the stage really might be set to move the state of Tennessee and some of these other southern states up higher in terms of their ranking nationally dealing with public education? Do you think that, for example, I think we talk about the lottery, the access scholarships, and et cetera. Do you think that that might be one of the ways that we might be able to deal with some of the issues that we have?
That's an excellent point. And I think anytime you have some type of money to add to education is certainly going to help improve it. So I think that is. But we also have to look at the most recent data that's come out. You look at our educational system in America, it's still kind of subservient to other European countries when it comes to math and science and those types of things. Our report card came out relatively low again. So we have to really give it some serious thought, and I think with the lottery funds, with any types of funds that needed to be placed, we need to think about the culture in which we are living in and how we are being impacted by this new technology that is there. And new technology is excellent, but it has to be used in the correct way to try to improve our skills. And most of it, of course, comes from just being focused.
Very good. And of course, Dr. Sanford, let me thank you over the last few seconds that we have here for that excellent information dealing with the public education system and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And let me encourage our audience to tune in again next week for another informative edition of Comments. Thank you and good morning.